Captain Jake Morrison was elbow-deep in what could only be described as the galaxy's most neurotic three-headed space hamster when his comm unit decided to ruin his day. The little furball named Fluffy by its overly attached owner had somehow managed to get all three of its heads tangled in its own tail, and each head was blaming the other two with increasingly creative alien profanity. "Look, Fluffy," Jake muttered, carefully untangling what appeared to be interdimensional fur. "I get it. Nobody likes Mondays. But this is Tuesday, and frankly you're making it weird for both of us." The hamster's middle head chittered something that his universal translator helpfully rendered as "your mother was a toaster," which was both anatomically impossible and oddly specific. Jake had been a veterinarian specializing in exotic alien pets for 7 years now, and he'd learned that the universe had a sick sense of humor when it came to the creatures it produced. That's when his comm unit started blaring with the kind of urgent official-sounding alarm that usually meant someone very important was about to make his life very complicated. "Captain Morrison," came a voice that dripped with the kind of authority that paid really, really well. "This is Royal Aide Pip, speaking on behalf of Her Imperial Majesty Queen Vex'ara of the Zephyrian Empire." Jake paused mid-untangle. The Zephyrian Empire was the kind of galactic superpower that could turn entire star systems into decorative paperweights if they were having a bad hair day. Their queen was rumored to eat diplomats for breakfast and use their bones as toothpicks. "Yeah, hi," Jake said, because apparently his mouth had decided to work independently of his brain's survival instincts. "Let me guess, somebody's prize-winning deathworm has the sniffles." "Actually, sir," Pip continued, his voice carrying the sort of nervous tremor that suggested he was probably updating his resume in real time, "it's about Grimjaw." The three-headed hamster suddenly went very, very quiet. In fact, every creature in Jake's clinic seemed to collectively hold its breath, which was impressive considering half of them didn't technically have lungs. Grimjaw. Even Jake, who made it a point to stay blissfully ignorant of galactic politics, knew that name. Grimjaw was Queen Vex'ara's personal war dragon, a creature reportedly the size of a small moon with the temperament of a caffeinated tornado. Military strategists used Grimjaw's mood swings to plan entire campaigns. Insurance companies had a separate category of natural disaster just for him. "Let me get this straight," Jake said slowly, setting down the now completely still hamster. "You want me to treat Grimjaw? The Grimjaw, the thing that once ate an entire rebel fleet because they interrupted his nap. He's dying, Captain Morrison," Pip said, and Jake could practically hear the desperation bleeding through the comm. "The Queen has tried everything. Every specialist in the known galaxy. You're our last hope." Jake looked around his modest clinic, taking in the collection of bandaged tentacles, cone-wearing blob creatures, and one particularly judgmental-looking space parrot that seemed to be shaking its head at him. This was his life. Quiet, predictable, and remarkably free of things that could vaporize him with their morning breath. "Yeah, that's gonna be a hard pass from me, buddy," Jake said, reaching for the disconnect button. "I specialize in creatures that won't accidentally reduce me to subatomic particles if I check their reflexes wrong. Captain Morrison, please." Click. Jake turned back to the hamster, which was now staring at him with all 6 eyes in what could only be described as profound disappointment. "Don't look at me like that," he told Fluffy. "I may be stupid, but I'm not crazy." The hamster made a sound that the translator interpreted as "we'll see about that," which in hindsight, was probably the universe's way of laughing at him. Within 6 hours of Jake hanging up on Royal Aide Pip, his comm unit had turned into a highlight reel of the galaxy's most creative ways to say absolutely not. It started with Dr. Kelvin Brooks, the cybernetic veterinarian, whose chrome-plated clinic orbited the tech hub of Neo Singapore Station. "Morrison, you magnificent idiot." Brooks' voice crackled through the speakers, his robotic vocal cords somehow managing to convey both admiration and pity. "I heard about your little job offer. I don't do anything with more than 4 stomachs, 2 hearts, or the ability to breathe weapons-grade plasma. My insurance policy specifically has a no ancient death machines clause." "Wait. How did you even?" Jake started, but the line was already dead. The next call came from healer Mystique Zorla, whose crystalline form usually radiated the kind of zen calm that charged people 300 credits an hour just to be in the same room with her. Today she sounded like she'd been gargling gravel and anxiety. "Jake, sweetie," her melodic voice had taken on a distinctly strained quality. "I tried to meditate on your situation, send some good vibes into the universe for guidance. My healing crystals literally caught fire. Not metaphorically fire. Actual physical call the fire department fire. The universe is screaming do not want so loud it's setting my meditation room ablaze." "That seems like a pretty clear message," Jake admitted. The ashes spelled out Uran in 17 different languages. "I don't even know where my crystals learned Klingon." Before Jake could respond, His comm was pinging again. This time it was Professor Rita Vance from the Galactic Institute of Xenobiology, calling from her research station that studied dangerous creatures from what the scientific community politely termed a very, very safe distance. Morrison, Rita's voice carried the breathless excitement of someone who'd spent too many years around graduate students and caffeine. I heard through the academic grapevine about your career-ending opportunity. I mean, career possibly ending. Actually, let's be honest. Life possibly ending. You're really selling this, Jake said dryly. Listen, I've been studying apex predators for 20 years. I know everything there is to know about Grimjaw's species. Their anatomy, their behavioral patterns, their dietary preferences, their 47 different ways of expressing displeasure that all involve varying degrees of incineration. But here's the thing, Jake, I study them. From orbit. Through really, really good telescopes. I don't poke them with needles and ask them to say ah. The calls kept coming. Dr. Marcus Webb from the Military Veterinary Corps explained that his license specifically excluded anything that could be classified as a tactical nuclear weapon. The famous animal psychic, Madame Zelda, claimed her third eye had taken one look at the situation and promptly requested a transfer to a different dimension. Even Dr. Sarah Kovac, who specialized in treating the Titan worms of Proxima 7, sent a message that simply said, nope, in 73 different alien scripts. By the time Jake's comm unit finally stopped pinging, he'd received refusals from specialists across the galaxy. Some were polite, some were panicked, and a few were just creative ways of saying I like my molecules exactly where they are. Thank you very much. The last message came from his old mentor Dr. Elizabeth Harper, who'd taught him everything he knew about alien anatomy. Her holographic image flickered to life with the kind of parental disappointment that transcended species barriers. Jake, honey, she said, her voice carrying that special tone reserved for students who were about to do something spectacularly stupid. I taught you better than this. When the entire galactic medical community collectively decides something is a bad idea, that's usually what we call a clue. Grimjaw isn't just dangerous, he's a geological event with teeth. Please tell me you're not actually considering this. Jake stared at the pile of rejection messages accumulating in his inbox. Each one was a variation on the same theme. Absolutely positively. Under no circumstances. Not if you paid us in solid platinum. No. Which made it all the more confusing when his comm unit rang again, and Pip's nervous voice filled his clinic once more. Captain Morrison, I do hope you've had time to reconsider. Her Majesty is prepared to be very generous with compensation. Jake looked at his three-headed hamster patient, who had somehow managed to untangle itself, and was now staring at him with what appeared to be smug satisfaction. Define very generous, Jake heard himself say, apparently having learned nothing from the last 4 hours of universal warnings. How does 50 million credits sound? Jake's coffee mug slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers and shattered on the floor. The universe, it seemed, had a really twisted sense of humor. Jake stared at the broken coffee mug on his clinic floor, his brain trying to process the number Pip had just casually dropped into the conversation like it was the cost of a sandwich. 50 million, Jake repeated slowly, because apparently his mouth needed to hear it again to believe it. Credits. As in, the kind of money that could buy a small moon. Actually, sir, Pip's voice carried the helpful tone of someone who'd clearly done the math at current market rates. You could buy approximately 2.5 small moons, or 1 medium-sized moon with a nice view. Jake's internal dialogue was having what could only be described as a full-scale civil war. On one side was his rational brain, screaming things like self-preservation, and remember what happened to the last guy who tried to give Grimjaw a checkup. On the other side was the part of his brain that kept track of his student loan payments, his mother's increasingly disappointed calls about his career choices, and the fact that his clinic's rent was due next Tuesday. I'm going to regret this, Jake muttered. Then louder, Pip, you still there? Yes sir, holding my breath actually. Make it 75 million, and I want hazard pay, life insurance that covers death by legendary space dragon, and a really good bottle of whiskey for afterward. Assuming there is an afterward. There was a pause that lasted just long enough for Jake to imagine Pip frantically calculating whether the Zephyrian Empire's treasury could handle the additional 25 million, or if he'd have to explain to his queen why her last hope had just priced himself out of the market. Done, Pip said, so quickly that Jake realized he probably could have asked for 100 million. Her Majesty will send a royal transport immediately. Of course she will, Jake sighed, looking around his clinic. The three-headed hamster gave him what appeared to be a thumbs up with one of its tiny paws. I don't suppose this could wait until next week. I've got a spa appointment for a particularly neurotic space slug, and Captain Morrison. Pip interrupted, his voice taking on the kind of desperate edge that suggested royal heads might literally roll if this went badly. Grimjaw hasn't eaten in 3 days. For a dragon his size, that's concerning. Concerning how? Like he's getting cranky, or like his digestive system is about to collapse and take half the royal palace with it. Yes, 20 minutes later, Jake found himself standing in the loading bay of the most ridiculous excuse for a spaceship he'd ever seen. The Zephyrian Royal Transport was the kind of vessel that screamed, "We have more money than sense," in 17 different languages. Everything was either gold-plated, jewel-encrusted, or making soft humming sounds that probably cost more than most planets' annual budgets. Pip turned out to be a nervous bird-like alien who stood about 4 feet tall and appeared to be having a continuous anxiety attack. His feathers kept changing colors in what Jake assumed was either a natural stress response or a really unfortunate fashion choice. "Captain Morrison," Pip chirped, his feathers cycling rapidly through shades of worry. "I cannot express how grateful Her Majesty is that you've agreed to help. Grimjaw means everything to her." "Right," Jake said, settling into a chair that was probably worth more than his entire clinic. "So tell me about the patient. What are his symptoms? When did they start? Has he been eating anything unusual? Besides rebel fleets, I mean." Pip's feathers went a particularly alarming shade of purple. "Well, that's just it, sir. He's been completely lethargic for a week now. Won't eat, won't incinerate anything, barely responds to stimuli. The royal physicians examined him from a safe distance and declared it hopeless." "What's a safe distance for a dragon that size?" "The next star system over," Jake nodded thoughtfully. "And you're sure he's actually sick? Not just, depressed, seasonal affective disorder? Maybe he's just tired of the whole terror of the galaxies thing and wants to take up watercolors or something." "Sir," Pip said seriously, his feathers settling into a resolute shade of determination, "Grimjaw once reduced an entire pirate armada to constituent atoms because they interrupted his afternoon nap. Yesterday, a squad of maintenance droids cleaned his lair, and he didn't even open one eye." The transport shuddered slightly as they dropped out of hyperspace, and through the viewport, Jake could see the Zephyrian homeworld growing larger. It was the kind of planet that looked like someone had taken a perfectly normal world and decided to accessorize it with enough orbital defense platforms to discourage casual visitors. "There's one more thing, Captain Morrison," Pip said as they began their descent toward the royal palace. "Her Majesty wanted me to mention that Grimjaw has been, well, he's been making sounds." "What kind of sounds?" "The kind that loosely translate to 'I want my mommy' in Ancient Dragon." Jake stared out the viewport at the approaching palace, a structure that looked like someone had taken a mountain and decided it needed more towers and dramatic lighting. Somewhere in that architectural fever dream was apparently the galaxy's most feared creature, crying for its mother. "You know what?" Jake said, settling back in his ridiculously expensive chair. "This day just keeps getting better and better." As they touched down in a landing bay that could have doubled as a small city, Jake caught his first glimpse of Queen Vexera herself, waiting at the bottom of the ramp. She was exactly as intimidating as advertised, standing 7 feet tall with the kind of presence that suggested she'd conquered solar systems before breakfast, and was now looking for something more challenging to do with her afternoon. "Captain Morrison," her voice could have cut diamond, "thank you for coming. Grimjaw is this way." Jake followed her deeper into the palace, his footsteps echoing in corridors that seemed designed to make visitors feel very, very small. As they walked, he could hear it in the distance, a low, mournful sound that was probably making seismologists on 3 different continents very nervous. It was, unmistakably, the sound of the galaxy's deadliest creature having a really bad day. The first thing Jake noticed about Grimjaw's lair was that it had been built inside what used to be a mountain. The second thing he noticed was that the mountain had apparently been hollowed out by someone with both unlimited resources and a severe case of architectural overcompensation. The third thing he noticed was the smell. "Oh, good grief," Jake muttered, pulling out a portable air filter and strapping it over his nose. "When was the last time anyone cleaned in here?" Queen Vexera's expression shifted to something that might have been embarrassment if she weren't genetically incapable of such pedestrian emotions. "Grimjaw has been protective of his space lately. The cleaning staff has been hesitant to enter." "By hesitant, you mean they keep mysteriously disappearing?" "By hesitant, I mean they keep requesting hazard pay that exceeds the GDP of small nations." As they rounded a corner that had been carved directly into the living rock, Jake got his first look at the patient. His brain immediately filed Grimjaw under things that should not exist in a rational universe. The dragon was roughly the size of a commercial starship, covered in scales that shifted color like oil on water, and possessed approximately 600 teeth that Jake could see from where he stood. Each tooth was roughly the size of a regulation baseball bat, and he was whimpering. Not the kind of whimpering that suggested mild discomfort, but the full-throated, pathetic whimpering of a creature that wanted the entire galaxy to know he was having the worst day of his very long life. The sound echoed through the chamber with enough volume to probably register on nearby seismic monitoring stations. "Okay," Jake said, setting down his medical kit and trying to project the kind of confidence he absolutely did not feel. "Let's start with the basics. Has he been eating?" "Nothing for 3 days," Pip chirped nervously from behind what appeared to be a blast shield. "Before that he was only picking at his food." "What does he usually eat?" Queen Vexera gestured toward a feeding area that looked like it had been designed by someone who really wanted to make sure their dragon got proper nutrition. "Rare metals, mostly. Titanium alloy is his favorite, though he's partial to chromium steel as an occasional treat. We also supplement with concentrated energy crystals and the occasional asteroid." Jake stared at her. "He eats metal. And crystals, very important for scale health." "Right. Of course, metal and crystals." Jake made a note in his medical pad, right next to his earlier notation that read client may be completely insane. "Any changes to his regular diet recently?" "Well," Pip interjected, his feathers cycling through what Jake was beginning to recognize as his nervous color palette. "There was that incident last week with the asteroid belt." "What kind of incident?" Queen Vexera waved a dismissive hand. "Minor territorial dispute with some pirates. Grimjaw was feeling peckish, so we let him graze in the disputed asteroid field. Cleaned up the pirate problem, and gave him some exercise." Jake looked at Grimjaw, who had noticed their presence, and was now regarding them with eyes the size of dinner plates. The dragon's expression could only be described as accusatory, as if he were personally holding Jake responsible for his current discomfort. "Let me get this straight," Jake said slowly. "You let your dragon eat random space rocks from a contested asteroid field, and now you're surprised he's not feeling well." "Those were premium asteroids," Queen Vexera said defensively. "The pirates wouldn't have been fighting over them if they weren't valuable." Jake approached Grimjaw slowly, hands visible, making the kind of soft, reassuring sounds he usually reserved for particularly traumatized space cats. The dragon watched him warily, but didn't immediately attempt to reduce him to component molecules, which Jake took as a positive sign. "Hey there, big guy," Jake said softly. "I hear you're not feeling so great. Mind if I take a look?" Grimjaw made a sound that Jake's universal translator rendered as something between "help me" and "please make it stop." It was honestly heartbreaking. Jake pulled out his portable scanner and ran it over Grimjaw's massive form. The readings that came back made him pause, frown, and run the scan again. "Well, that's interesting," he muttered. "What is it?" Queen Vexera demanded, stepping closer. "Is it serious, terminal? Should I start preparing funeral arrangements for a creature the size of a city block?" Jake held up a hand, studying the scanner readings more carefully. Grimjaw's internal scans showed exactly what he'd suspected based on the symptoms, the dietary history, and his own experience with creatures who had more appetite than sense. "Your Majesty," Jake said, turning to face the Queen with the kind of expression he usually reserved for pet owners who'd let their alien hamsters eat their homework. "Your dragon has a stomachache." The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat echoing in the cavernous chamber. "A stomachache," Queen Vexera repeated, her voice carrying the kind of dangerous calm that probably preceded the last words several diplomats had ever heard. "A really bad stomachache," Jake clarified. "Those premium asteroids you mentioned. According to my scans, about 40% of them were contaminated with industrial waste, heavy metals, toxic compounds, and what appears to be the remnants of several crashed mining ships. Grimjaw basically ate the equivalent of a toxic waste dump." Pip made a sound that his translator helpfully rendered as "oh dear," in approximately 17 different languages. "So the terror of the galaxy," Jake continued, unable to keep the amusement out of his voice. "The creature that has toppled governments and caused grown military commanders to wet themselves, is currently incapacitated by the interstellar equivalent of food poisoning." Grimjaw, as if understanding every word, let out another pitiful whimper, and managed to look even more pathetic than a 600-ton dragon had any right to look. Queen Vexera was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying a note of dangerous warning. "Captain Morrison, if you are suggesting that my dragon, the apex predator of the known galaxy, is currently defeated by indigestion. Oh, I'm not suggesting it, Jake interrupted, his medical scanner beeping happily as it confirmed his diagnosis. I'm stating it as a medical fact. The good news is, it's completely treatable. The bad news is, it's going to require me to get a lot more up close and personal with your dragon than either of us probably wants. He turned back to Grimjaw, who was watching him with an expression that somehow managed to convey both hope and skepticism. Jake reached out slowly, and patted one massive scale. The dragon's hide was warm to the touch, and surprisingly smooth. Don't worry, buddy, Jake said softly. We're going to get you feeling better. But fair warning, this is probably going to be the most embarrassing medical emergency in galactic history. Grimjaw's response was another pathetic whimper, followed by what could only be described as the universe's largest and most dangerous creature having a moment of profound self-pity. Jake looked at Queen Vexera and Pip, both of whom were staring at him with expressions of mixed relief and disbelief. So, he said, pulling on his examination gloves, anyone want to guess how we're going to explain this to the galactic news networks?
All right, Jake said, rolling up his sleeves and staring at the mountain of dragon in front of him. Let's talk about the treatment plan. The good news is, this is basically just a really extreme case of digestive blockage. The bad news is, I'm going to have to go inside to clear it out. Queen Vexera blinked. Inside, Jake confirmed, pulling what looked like a high-tech spelunking suit out of his medical kit. Grimjaw's got about 40 tons of contaminated metal and space debris backing up his digestive system. Standard procedure for large-scale blockages is manual extraction. You want to climb inside my dragon, the Queen said slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made any more sense the second time around. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds weird, Jake replied, checking the seals on his environmental suit. But yeah, basically. Don't worry, I do this kind of thing all the time. Last month I had to clear a blockage out of a Venusian crystal whale. Admittedly, that one was only the size of a city bus, but the principle's the same. Pip's feathers had gone completely white, which Jake was beginning to suspect meant either extreme terror or the alien equivalent of a nervous breakdown. Captain Morrison, surely there must be another way. Medication? Surgery from the outside? A really long pair of tweezers? Jake shook his head, running a final diagnostic on his suit's life support systems. Afraid not. The blockage is too deep and too complex for external extraction. Plus, dragons have this annoying tendency to explode if you try to cut into them while they're backed up with toxic waste. Something about the interaction between their internal fire glands and industrial chemicals. Very messy. How messy? Queen Vexera asked. Remember what happened to the Kepler mining station? That was an industrial accident. The Queen paused, her expression shifting to one of dawning horror. That was a dragon? Dragon with a belly full of unstable isotopes and a really bad case of indigestion. The crater's still glowing. Jake approached Grimjaw, who had been following the conversation with the kind of intelligent attention that reminded everyone present that dragons were significantly smarter than most people gave them credit for. The great creature's eyes tracked Jake's movements, and when the veterinarian held up the environmental suit, Grimjaw made a sound that the universal translator rendered as, "You're going to do what now?" "Look, buddy," Jake said, patting Grimjaw's snout reassuringly. "I know this is weird for both of us, but you've got a traffic jam in your digestive tract that would make a city planner weep, and I'm the guy who has to go in there and direct traffic. Try not to digest me, okay?" Grimjaw's response was a low rumble that might have been agreement, or might have been the sound of a creature contemplating whether his current discomfort was worth tolerating a tiny organic being crawling around his internal organs. The entrance procedure was, Jake had to admit, probably the strangest part of his veterinary career to date. Grimjaw helpfully opened his massive jaws, revealing a mouth that could have doubled as a small aircraft hangar. Jake activated his suit's lighting system, and stepped carefully onto the dragon's tongue, which was roughly the size and texture of a regulation basketball court. "Okay, Grimjaw," Jake called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous mouth. "I'm going to need you to swallow now. And try to keep the digestive acids to a minimum. Yeah? This suit is rated for hostile environments, not industrial-strength stomach acid." The sensation of being swallowed by a dragon was not something Jake had ever expected to experience, and he made a mental note to charge extra for unique life experiences on future invoices. The journey down Grimjaw's esophagus was like sliding down the world's most expensive and terrifying water slide. If water slides were made of living tissue, and occasionally pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. "How are you doing in there, Captain Morrison?" Pip's voice crackled through his suit's comm system. "Oh, just living the dream," Jake replied, as he tumbled into what appeared to be Grimjaw's first stomach.
The view is exactly as horrifying as you'd expect, and the smell is something that's going to require therapy to forget. Grimjaw's digestive system was a marvel of biological engineering. Assuming you enjoyed marvels that looked like the inside of a very large, very alive cave system, Jake activated his suit's scanner and began mapping the layout, looking for the source of the blockage. Found it, he announced, as his lights illuminated what could only be described as a traffic jam of epic proportions. Chunks of contaminated asteroid, pieces of mining equipment, and what appeared to be the remains of several unlucky spacecraft had formed a solid wall across the dragon's digestive tract. Grimjaw buddy, your eating habits are terrible. I'm seeing industrial waste, ship hulls, and is that a traffic light? From outside, he could hear Grimjaw make an embarrassed rumbling sound. Okay Queen Vex era, Jake called through his comm. I'm going to start the extraction process. Fair warning, Grimjaw's probably going to experience some discomfort, and dragons express discomfort by making sounds that register on the Richter scale. Understood, came the Queen's voice, though Jake could hear her shouting orders in the background that sounded suspiciously like evacuate the lower levels. Jake activated his suit's industrial tools and got to work. The contaminated debris had to be carefully separated and extracted piece by piece, a process that required equal parts medical knowledge, engineering skills, and a complete disregard for personal safety. As he worked, he kept up a running commentary, partly for his own sanity and partly because the absurdity of the situation demanded narration. Okay, that's definitely part of a mining laser, he muttered, carefully extracting a piece of equipment that was roughly the size of a small car. And this appears to be someone's lunchbox. Really hope they weren't still using it. Grimjaw's digestive system responded to the extraction process with a series of rumbles, gurgles and sounds that Jake's translator thoughtfully rendered as that tickles and please be careful in there. The dragon was, Jake had to admit, being remarkably patient about having a tiny human performing internal maintenance. You know Grimjaw, Jake said, as he worked on dislodging what appeared to be the entire engine block of a small starship. You're actually pretty well behaved for a legendary terror. Most of my patients try to bite me when I'm working on them. The response was a gentle rumble that somehow managed to convey both gratitude and mild embarrassment. How much longer, Captain Morrison? Queen Vex era's voice carried a kind of tension that suggested she was having to deal with increasingly concerned reports from her palace staff about the seismic activity. Almost done, Jake replied, extracting the last major piece of debris. Just need to clear the smaller particles and there we go. The moment the blockage cleared, Jake felt the entire digestive tract around him shift and flow as Grimjaw's system began working properly again. The dragon's relieved sigh was audible even from inside his stomach, and Jake could swear he felt the creature's whole body relax. Extraction complete, Jake announced. Grimjaw, I'm going to need you to help me get out of here now, and maybe warn everyone that you're probably going to feel a lot better very quickly. The trip back up was significantly more dignified than the trip down, mostly because Grimjaw seemed to have regained control of his bodily functions, and was able to carefully expel Jake back into the main chamber. Jake emerged from the dragon's mouth covered in dragon saliva, and looking like he'd been through a very specialized car wash. Well, he said, pulling off his helmet and wiping dragon drool from his face, that was educational. Grimjaw meanwhile was already looking significantly better. His scales had regained their lustrous sheen, his eyes were bright and alert, and he was sitting up with the kind of posture that suggested he was no longer in severe digestive distress. Queen Vex era stared at Jake, then at her dragon, then back at Jake. That's it? He's cured? Give him a few hours to fully process everything. But yeah, Jake said, packing up his equipment. He should be back to his normal terrifying self by tomorrow. Though maybe consider screening his food sources in the future. Industrial waste is not part of a balanced dragon diet. As if to prove Jake's point, Grimjaw stretched, yawned in a way that revealed all 600 of his teeth, and then did something that made everyone in the chamber freeze. He purred, not the small domestic cat kind of purring, but a deep rumbling purr that resonated through the mountain, and probably registered on seismic equipment across the continent. It was the sound of a very large, very dangerous creature who was feeling much better and wanted everyone to know about it. Well, Jake said, shouldering his medical kit, I'd say that counts as a successful treatment. The next morning, Jake woke up in the most ridiculously luxurious guest quarters he'd ever seen, feeling like he'd been hit by a starship but oddly satisfied with his life choices. His first indication that something had changed came when he looked out his window and saw Grimjaw sitting in the palace courtyard like the world's largest, most dangerous golden retriever, apparently waiting for something. That something, Jake realized with dawning horror, is probably me. When he made his way down to the courtyard, Grimjaw's massive head immediately swiveled toward him, and the dragon made a sound that Jake's universal translator rendered as "my favorite person is here." The enthusiasm was both heartwarming and absolutely terrifying coming from a creature that could level city blocks. Queen Vexera was already waiting, looking considerably more relaxed than she had the previous day. Pip stood beside her, his feathers a cheerful shade of yellow that Jake was beginning to recognize as his version of cautious optimism. "Captain Morrison," the Queen said, inclining her head in what was probably the closest thing to a bow that galactic royalty ever managed, "Grimjaw has made a full recovery. His appetite has returned, his energy levels are normal, and he's already requested his favorite breakfast of chromium steel with a side of energy crystals." "That's great," Jake started to say, then paused as he noticed the way Grimjaw was looking at him. It was the same look he'd seen on countless pets when their owners were about to leave after a vet visit. "Why do I get the feeling there's more to this conversation?" Queen Vexera exchanged a glance with Pip, who somehow managed to look nervous and excited at the same time. "Captain Morrison, there's something we need to discuss, about Grimjaw's career." "His career? As a war dragon," the Queen clarified. "You see, there's been a problem we've been dealing with for some time now. Grimjaw is without question the most powerful creature in our military arsenal. His reputation alone has prevented more conflicts than our entire diplomatic corps." Jake nodded slowly, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "However," the Queen continued, "he's also possibly the gentlest creature I've ever met. Yesterday's treatment confirmed what we've suspected for years. Grimjaw doesn't actually want to hurt anyone." As if on cue, Grimjaw lowered his massive head toward Jake and made a soft chirping sound that the translator rendered as "pet me please." Jake, operating on pure instinct, reached out and scratched behind one of the dragon's enormous horns. Grimjaw's purring resumed, causing small tremors in the palace foundation. "The truth is," Queen Vexera said, watching this interaction with what might have been amusement, "Grimjaw has never actually killed anyone. All those stories about destroyed fleets and incinerated armies, creative propaganda. Whenever we send him into battle, he just flies around making terrifying noises until the enemy surrenders and runs away." Jake stared at her. "You're telling me the terror of the galaxy has been running the universe's most successful bluff for how long?" "Approximately 237 years. Pip chirped helpfully. "He's remarkably consistent about it. The one time we tried to make him actually fight," the Queen continued, "he had what your human psychologist would probably call a panic attack. Spent 3 days hiding in his cave making sad noises. We decided it was better for everyone if we just let him be scary from a distance." Jake looked at Grimjaw, who had rolled over onto his back like a massive scaly dog wanting belly rubs. The sight of a creature that could theoretically eat small moons wiggling happily in the palace courtyard was both adorable and utterly surreal. "So what does this have to do with me?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "We need someone to take care of him," Queen Vexera said simply. "Someone who isn't afraid of him, who understands his needs, and who can keep him healthy and happy. Someone who can handle the responsibility of caring for the galaxy's most famous fake monster." "You're offering me a job as a dragon babysitter." "We prefer the term Dragon Wellness Coordinator," Pip interjected. "It sounds more professional on business cards." Jake looked around the palace courtyard, taking in the absurd opulence, the gentle giant of a dragon who was now rolling around in what appeared to be pure joy, and the alien queen who was essentially asking him to become the galaxy's most overpaid pet sitter. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly. "You want to pay me 75 million credits to take care of a dragon who's basically a giant puppy with a public relations problem." "The salary is negotiable," Queen Vexera said quickly. "We're also prepared to offer comprehensive health benefits, unlimited vacation time, and your own wing of the palace. Plus Grimjaw comes with his own staff of royal caretakers who handle the day-to-day maintenance like scale polishing and cave cleaning." Grimjaw, apparently understanding that the conversation was about him, rolled back over and fixed Jake with a hopeful expression that somehow managed to be utterly pathetic despite coming from a creature that could theoretically bite a space station in half. "And if I say no?" Jake asked. "Then we'll have to find someone else willing to take the job," the Queen replied. "Though I should mention that you're the first person in over 50 years that Grimjaw has actually seemed to like. Usually he just hides whenever strangers come around." Jake looked at Grimjaw, who made a small questioning sound that the translator rendered as "Are you going to stay?" The dragon's expression was so hopeful that Jake felt something inside his chest do a complicated emotional maneuver that his student loan debt couldn't quite override. "You know what the really ridiculous part of this is?" Jake said finally. "I actually like him. He's probably the best patient I've ever had. Didn't try to bite me once, even when I was literally performing internal surgery. Is that a yes? Pip asked, his feathers cycling through what Jake was beginning to recognize as excited anticipation. Jake sighed, looking around at his new life of luxury, responsibility, and cosmic-scale absurdity. I'm going to need that bottle of whiskey you promised. And probably a really good therapist. And maybe some business cards that say Dragon Wellness Coordinators, because honestly that does sound better than guy who crawls inside space monsters for a living. Queen Vexera smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness Jake had seen from her. Welcome to the team, Captain Morrison. Grimjaw's response was a joyful roar that probably registered on seismic equipment across 3-star systems, followed by what could only be described as the galaxy's most dangerous creature doing a little happy dance in the palace courtyard. As Jake watched his new patient celebrate, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, this was going to be the worst decision he'd ever made. After all, how many people could say they'd gotten rich by giving the universe's most famous monster a really good belly rub? Just one question, Jake said, as Grimjaw settled down next to him like a mountain-sized cat claiming its favorite human. What exactly do I tell people when they ask what I do for a living? Queen Vexera considered this seriously. How about interstellar diplomatic relations specialist with a focus on conflict de-escalation through advanced medical intervention? Jake looked at her, then at Pip, then at Grimjaw, who was now purring contentedly and occasionally nuzzling Jake's shoulder with a head the size of a small building. You know what, he said, scratching behind Grimjaw's horn and feeling the dragon's happy rumble resonate through his bones. I think I can live with that. And somewhere in the distance, Jake's universal translator picked up what sounded suspiciously like the universe itself chuckling at the cosmic joke of it all.